All right, well, welcome to the TCIPG seminar series. It's our pleasure today to have Robert Former giving the talk today. He's been in the business for over 20 years. He has worked in lots and lots of aspects of information security, in information technology, and mostly recently in security. He's got all the important certifications. He's right now working for Itron, who's a manufacturer of energy measurement systems. He's the principal security engineer there. In his spare time, he enjoys spending time with his family. Good. Pursuing photography. As we were walking to lunch, he was finding all sorts of things he wanted to take pictures of. And we're delighted that you're here today and talk with us. Robert.
Thank you very much. So, the introduction saves me from having to put the ego slide up, so that should move things along nicely. What we're going to talk about today is threats. Now, different people think of the word threats in different ways, so to start with, I'd like to define what constitutes a threat in the context of this talk. A threat is an agent, or a process, or a person that can cause harm, disruption, basically bad things. So we're not necessarily going to get too deep into concepts of vulnerabilities, or I'll touch on vulnerabilities, I'll touch on risks, but I primarily would like to talk about threats because AMI, automated metering infrastructure, has introduced a huge increase in threats to power metering. The traditional threats to power metering were people who basically wanted to steal power. And this was a very small group of people, a very dedicated group of people, but their impact on utilities was minimal. There are traditional systems in place to catch them. When my slides show up, we'll go over those. In AMI, all of a sudden, we have opened the ability to look into the side of someone's house and see how much power they're using, to talk to the side of someone's house and turn their power off, to talk to the meter, change the firmware, and change how the power is metered. And this opens, and it can all be done theoretically, mind you. This is all theoretically, remotely. You don't need to be at the side of the house. You don't need to be in the truck out on the street. You can be sitting somewhere in Florida and do this for somebody in Oregon. It doesn't matter. As long as you can get connected into the system and the utility has not exercised the proper controls to keep you from connecting into the system, there are many very bad things that you can do. See, this is the point where I was going to count on my slides to keep me directed on what I was doing. Utilities are used to dealing with the old threats, okay? And a phrase that has become very common in our industry is the baseball bat. Well, what can I do to this meter remotely that I couldn't just walk up to it and do with a baseball bat? I could destroy this meter with a baseball bat. That's going to disconnect the guy's power. I can sit across the street and shoot it with a .22 long rifle. This will disconnect the guy's power. Therefore, it's no more risk than this person doing this. But the context that's being missed is the ability to do it remotely. And the different people who want to do it now, because your threats are no longer just the people who want to save money on electricity or turn on their disconnected power or simply do something anarchist and nihilist and just start destroying things for the sheer joy of it. Recalls my teenage years. Now you have nation-state actors. When you aggregate the capability to turn off electricity to a house into tens, hundreds, thousands, millions of houses, an entire city the size of New York or Los Angeles or even Omaha. Let's go to the heartland where we can really scare people. If you could turn off the power to that entire city, you would scare an entire country. This would be almost the equivalent of blowing up a building full of people kind of scared. Huge national attention, huge international attention, and the possibilities of what you can do with this are huge. Most people immediately go to, what if a nation-state actor that is hostile toward us, I'm not going to name any particular nation-state, because this equipment is being deployed in many different nations. So the players change depending on who the target is. But let's say, what is it, Slavonia? I don't know, some Dilbert country. Random country wants to do me harm. They figured out how to hack into my meters. They have the capability. What are they going to do with it? This is the equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb. This is not something that you can just do lightly. It is an attack. It is a military attack, which changes how likely it is to happen. So for all of the hue and cry and concern over the nation-state actors, they're not the ones that we need to be the most worried about. Your next set of players that can do mass damage is organized crime. Now let's take the idea of being able to shut off the entire city of Los Angeles. How much do you think the city of Los Angeles would pay you to not turn them off? Significant sums of money. You could potentially use this in an extortion fashion to make large sums of money. You could use it to threaten to do damage. The next potential actor, and this is where things get really fun, are politically motivated. Has anybody here noticed over the last year, 2 years, that the press surrounding AMI and smart meter and smart grid has become very politically heated? There have been a number of, I'm going to call them entertainment-based political commentators who tend to cluster toward AM radio, who have made comments like, Obama is going to turn off your dishwasher. Not real likely. But it's become heavily politicized because it's become associated with a given administration. Doesn't matter who the administration is. This could have been the previous administration. At any given time in America, whatever administration is in power now is the worst one we have ever had. There are people who are nostalgic for the Clinton years, for example. An important slide I forgot to reference. Stuxnet. Okay, I've said the word. We are now talking about Stuxnet. In any talk about smart metering, you have to say the word Stuxnet, apparently. I don't know why that is. Thieves, vandals, anarchists, nihilists, and terrorists, the traditional threats. Terrorists weren't that big a deal because you could only impact 1 meter at a time. But the motivations behind, we're back to traditional threats now, trying to get back on track with the slides. The traditional motivations for the traditional threats have pretty much clustered around theft. The ability to stick it to the man, I'm not paying for electricity, I deserve this, I'm entitled. Out of poverty or necessity, your power's been turned off, your house is freezing, you need to turn it back on. Or stealth. Let's say you find it necessary to install a vast array of high-intensity discharge lights because you like to engage in horticultural activities that tend to upset law enforcement. Stealth is a reason to do bypassing. You can also, making a statement, we go back to the political thing, but you can't make a very big statement by damaging a traditional meter, and the simple challenge of being able to do it. The traditional attacks that are used are bypass, go around the meter. The power flows past the meter, it's not metered, you get free electricity. Inversion. A lot of people don't know this, but you can turn a meter over. The old ones will run backwards and give you money back. Gaming the system. Some really clever things have come out of this. High-intensity magnets on the side can cause drag on the rotating disc and slow down your consumption metering, things of that nature. And then the traditional physical attacks of baseball bat, 12-gauge shotgun, and just pulling it out of the wall. Effort versus effect. The effort involved in the traditional attacks is frankly very low. You don't need to coordinate a lot of people. You don't need a great deal of high-tech equipment. You don't need a great deal of knowledge to do this. You need to know how to pull a meter off a wall and turn it over. The effect is limited to a single household or a single entity, and it's really not great as a political statement. The mitigations against the traditional threats have been primarily detective, finding out that something has happened. and they're not preventive. Okay, there's a little tag that you can cut off with side cutters. That's not a big deterrent to anybody who wants to turn a meter over. So the mitigations have come from human intelligence. The neighbor rats you out. The meter reader notices that there's something amiss with your meter, like the 2 big jumper cables that go around it. Business intelligence. You have traditionally used $400 in electricity because you have a really creaky old house that's more of a sponge than a wall, and all of a sudden you're using 100. There's business intelligence built into the billing systems that will look for anomalous billing behavior, and they will pay attention to it, believe me. And system intelligence. System intelligence is something that's newer than traditional metering, but not quite as new as AMI, where the utility will say, okay, we have metered N kilowatt hours through this substation, but we are only seeing billing for N minus 500, example. So they'll know that there's somewhere electricity is dropping off the wire, and that they know in that system that there isn't anywhere they should just be suffering heat loss or something similar. The risks traditionally have been to revenue, damaged equipment, and the cost of repair from a business perspective, and the safety risks. Risks to the attacker. There are stories of people who have tried to use butter knives to short across the terminals that the meter goes into to jumper it. If you do that 2 at a time, the effects are rather startling and fatal. And safety to others. Bypassing meters in many ways offers the opportunity for setting your house on fire as well, so you're endangering your family. So that's the way things have been to date. Now we move into the new century, the new millennium, and we have the emerging threats. What has changed? Communications. We can talk to the meters. We can pull the meters. We can control the meters. The service switch or disconnect switch can be managed through communications. System intelligence has increased. We know what's happening in the system on a much more granular level. We can see what is happening real time on a household basis. It used to be that the utilities were restricted to being able to do that at a neighborhood level, at a substation level. It was very high in the distribution network. Now it is at your doorstep. There is a broader attack surface. These things are really neat, and they're fun to attack. It's fun to figure out how to hack into this thing and make the microcontroller do your evil bidding. And there are millions of them out there. It's much easier to attack the system as a whole from the side of your neighbor's house, because you don't do it from your own house. There's a higher return for the effort that you put into it. You can, for example, there is a situation that I cannot comment on sources, but a commercialization of an attack has been developed. It is sold for certain sums of money for individuals, a different sum of money for businesses, and basically what somebody has done is they have gotten a higher return for their effort. They figured out how to change something in the meter, and they're selling it. So yes, they had to put more effort into it, but the return is 100-fold better. There are the new attackers. As we talked about, nation-state actors, terrorism, political activism, hacktivism, extortionists, a whole new swath of people and vectors that we need to consider in the power meter. And one of my personal favorite new ones, the disgruntled employee. The old attackers are still going to be after the same thing. They're going to want to save money on power, reconnect their power without the man knowing about it. It's the same personal fiscal return thing or personal political statement. So not much has changed for them, except how it gets done. The old attacks, by the way, are still valid. Inverting a meter doesn't work anymore. Actually, it sets off an alarm, but we'll talk about that a little further. The disgruntled consumer or employee. This is the situation I was just talking about, where a utility is finding that meters have been compromised and their customers are paying for anywhere from 10 to 90% off what they should be billed. This comes from disgruntled employees. These employees were really ticked off because there was some contract negotiation that had gone sideways, I believe. So they developed this and they said, okay, we're just going to get our money back a different way. So, angry employee. Angry employee can do very nasty things from inside the network too. Utilities aren't used to thinking about their business systems, their enterprise systems, as an attack vector. They've always looked outward to the meters, to the field. Now they have to consider inward. You have to protect against somebody either inadvertently or deliberately bringing in malware that will impact the system, potentially changing results, potentially turning meters on and off. And of course the opportunist. Hey, look, there's something new on the side of my house. I want to go break into it for fun. Effort versus effect. The old attacks are still out there, same effort, same effect. But the new attacks are more sophisticated. They require a higher degree of technical knowledge. For the most part, your average citizen isn't going to understand how to hack the registers on a TI microcontroller. So you're dealing with a more technically savvy and intelligent attacker at this point. But that also makes the pool of attackers smaller. There's a broader reach for a given attack. If I manage to compromise a full set of meters, I can potentially compromise more meters beyond that. The geographic effect of what I do expands significantly, which leads to a greater effect and greater noticeability, and there is more publicity. For years and years, people have been turning meters over and bypassing them, and you don't read about it in the news. I can guarantee you that it would hit Reuters and AP and every other newswire within seconds if an attack was mounted against an AMI system that was successful and visible. Because that would be huge news. Have you seen it in the news?
No, I haven't.
Well, the news is truth, you know. And all truth comes from the news. So if it's not in the news and it's not on the internet, it must not have ever happened. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Commentary beyond that I can't really go into at this point. The new risks that come from this, they're sort of the same, but they're bigger. Safety. We're no longer concerned simply with the safety of the individual who's trying to game the meter. Frankly, the person who's trying to game the meter isn't as often at risk. They're remotely. But the safety of the people in the house. If you can find out a way to operate that disconnect switch repeatedly for hours, on and off, once a second, eventually something's going to get hot and something is going to catch fire. There's a good chance of that. I can also tell you from personal experience, every meter I've dealt with has protections for that. But it's a risk. Well, beyond that safety, there is the safety of a wide range of people. Wide area outages generally result in some number of injuries from people running through traffic lights, people's home medical equipment not being powered anymore, people falling downstairs when the lights fall off. Broader risk to safety. But there's also risk to stability. If you take and start activating the disconnect switches on half a city, quarter of a city, one neighborhood, if you develop the ability to dump 300 megawatts of power off the grid in one shot, you are going to affect the stability of the entire distribution system in that area. Because everything upstream is going to have to figure out how to shed load and how to deal with it. So you affect the stability of a wider area than just the meters that you're impacting, potentially. Revenue. If you can modify, okay, the utility that's having this problem that I was discussing, the estimate is 10% penetration in their meters. 10% of millions of meters are estimated to have been compromised. The revenue implications of this are estimated to be upwards of $400 million a year. These attacks now have a dollar number on them. Makes them real. The risks around extortion, we discussed that, where you can take control of a system and say, pay me millions of dollars, or I will shut off the entire city of LA. I can't help but, in my mind, I have an image of Dr. Evil doing this. Unfortunately, I can't do the voice very well. Publicity. As I said before, something like this happens, it's going to hit the news, it's going to hit it fast, and there's going to be a great deal of commentary. A majority of it highly uninformed. The publicity cannot help but be very bad. And the final one, and this is the one that really, really, really scares the utilities, regulatory action. Right now, utilities, distribution, don't fall under FERC, NERC, or CIP because they have not traditionally been able to shed 300 megawatts of load. If this happens just once, the federal government will stand up, pay attention, lay down regulations, and that is going to require the formation of huge armies of people just to deal with paperwork and compliance. Of course, it'll also mean an uptick in money for consultants. Mitigations in the new system. With new technology, we get new tools. The traditional attacks have become easier to detect. If somebody takes a meter off the wall, now the meter has a super cap in it that keeps the processor running, and it has a motion detector in it. If you pull the meter off the wall, the meter feels it and calls home and says, hey, somebody took me off the wall. Business intelligence system should be able to correlate that to a work order. Is there supposed to be a lineman out here pulling a meter off the wall? No, raise a flag and send a cop. Same thing with meter inversion. If you pull a meter off the wall, turn it over and put it back in, it detects that it was pulled out, it detects that it was turned over, and it detects that power is flowing in the opposite direction. If you try to accomplish the same thing just by reversing the wires and not turning it around at all, it will still notice it because the power is flowing in a different direction. The intelligence in the meters gives us new ways to detect that something is going on. The new systems have some measure of security built in, and there's more security all the time being built in. There is encryption technology in every smart meter that's being sold today involves encryption technology. There is tamper detection, tamper evidence, the ability to call home when somebody's tampering with them. Traditional meters didn't have any of this. You pulled it off the wall, nobody knew that you'd done that until a meter reader came by and said, look, there's no meter on the wall. There are now preventative measures that we can undertake to keep some of the broader attacks from happening. There are rules that go into place in the business intelligence that keep you from being able to turn off a certain number of meters at a given time without a secondary authorization, for example. So that would keep a disgruntled employee from turning off an entire city block in one shot. It would raise a flag, and they have to have secondary authorization from a manager to do it. There are similar preventive measures that happen at the head end that prevent a lot of the potential threats from being realized as attacks. There are new administrative measures, and that goes back to some of the stuff that happens at the head end. You have to have authorization, authentication to have the ability to take any action. So you have auditability of action. And you can audit when somebody does something to a meter, including, my favorite, upgrading the firmware. Anything that happens to that meter can be audited. And the new detective measures with the ability to change the ability to detect a change in power direction, physical movement, inversion, somebody just rattling the cage, or wide sections of power being dropped without there being an administrative reason. I'm almost done, actually. So the question becomes, are we better off? Have we improved our lot from the perspective of power distribution? And my answer is yes, we are. Yes, we have introduced new risks. We have introduced new threats. There are new people who can do bad things. But we've also matched those new threats with new mitigations and new controls. None of this stuff has been put in place without consideration of the broader impact. And I know this runs contrary to a lot of the popular press these days, but the reality is utilities don't generally do stupid things. It doesn't make them money. We also have a great deal more flexibility. If we find that there is a new feature that can be implemented in the field that will be useful to consumers or useful to the utility, we can upgrade the firmware. We have the flexibility of being able to control load on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, the deliberate ability to manage rolling blackouts. Instead of having to turn it off substation by substation by substation as it has been done on the West Coast in the last few years, you can actually have people who will volunteer during heavy load times and say, okay, tell you what, shut off my air conditioner if there's a power emergency, shut off my furnace, turn off my stove. With that level of granularity, you have a great deal more flexibility, you have a great deal more agility. You can react to problems much quicker. You also have a broader vision and perspective on the system. You can look at a screen and see what a majority of the system is doing at any given time. Red lights pop up real easy on screens. And I saw a great demonstration today of a visualization system of what's happening in a system that I'm looking forward to seeing implemented in the real world. So that's it. That's what I see as the new threats. These are the threats that we're dealing with as a manufacturer. These are the threats that we see and we try to deal with as security professionals in the different industry groups. And of course, on my screen, there's a URL that says www.itron.com, because that's my employer and I have to get a plug-in. And my email address, robert.former@itron.com. So, questions? Sure. Oh, there's a microphone and everything.
Thank you. That was very interesting. So I'm curious, when you look at all these threats from either a vendor point of view or from a utility point of view, either perspective you'd like to share, how do you prioritize among the threats, given that some have lower probability, higher impact, but it's hard to reason very clearly on how to balance that probability of something happening and the impact. So what are some approaches that people take in practice?
It becomes a question of business risk, okay? It is not necessarily the job of the manufacturer to tell a utility what they have to protect against and what they don't have to protect against. A utility knows their business best. And different utilities have different risk appetites. And based on your risk appetite, what you're willing to put at risk versus revenue, that's going to shape how you answer a given threat. So a utility that has a potential exposure using a particular radio or over-the-air attack, they are going to have a different threat profile and response than a utility that doesn't use that particular technology. So it really varies from utility to utility, and it is best handled by the people who run the business. Does that answer your question?
What about the threat of privacy from all this data that's being collected?
The threat to privacy is still, okay, first of all, this is my opinion, okay? This is not the opinion of my employer or any of my sponsors. The threat to privacy is still tenuous because the data that exists inside a meter is not necessarily tied to personal information at this time. The place that information gets tied together is in the business intelligence at the head end, and that is inside the system from AMI. So it's a threat that's always existed, and that's why it doesn't show up on the threatscape here. It is outside the scope of AMI in and of itself. Yes, there is a great deal of concern because of the granularity of the data. Person can break into a major utility, find their way past all of the security controls to look at my data and find out when I'm at home to come in and steal my iPod. Not so much, I think, maybe. If you really want to know what a person's comings and goings and patterns are, you park a car up the street and watch them. That's one of those cases where there's an easier way to do it, and it's a viable, easier way to do it. Does that answer your question? Or did I just dance around it like a politician?
Well, you kind of use a similar reason for doing the. You don't have to park my car outside your house. I can do it from Florida.
Exactly. And from Florida, we run into a likelihood question. And you know what? You do have a good point, though. The ability to do it from Florida, it is a threat. And I apologize for not including it in my list. I stand corrected. It is a threat. It is a threat for which there are very strong mitigations in place, and the likelihood is still fairly low, but it does exist. And the answer to what do you do about the privacy of the data that exists inside that meter is you have layers of controls. You have IT controls, you have physical controls, administrative controls, all of these things that the same things that are protecting the service switch are also protecting the customer's data. So the threat is effectively addressed.
So in some of the papers that we've been writing, we've been making the same claim that you made, that power grids could potentially be stabilized in the event of a large-scale synchronized demand response event. We don't have much strong support for that claim as of now, except for one paper in the Chaos Journal that I found or something. So I'm just curious to know, where did you find the support for that claim? Because we might be able to... Yeah, the grid instability
For
claim.
grid
Yeah.
instability from flipping switches?
Right.
Anecdotal. This has come from discussions at industry conferences with my colleagues. My job at Itron, or one of my jobs at Itron, is to think of nasty, nasty things to do to our system, ways to break our system. And that was one of the first things that came up, and the whole concept of the ability to do such granular control and exercise it so widely. The ability to bring a segment up and down on a periodic basis in such a way that you could have a negative impact throughout the rest of the system. There are mitigations in place for that. Those mitigations tend to exist higher in the distribution chain than the metering people tend to look at. I don't honestly know what exactly is being done to manage that, but it is a risk that has been considered. It is a valid risk. There is support for it in the industry. There are just no white papers around it. Might be a good grad student project.
What is the extent of the dispersion of meters actually in businesses and homes, and to what extent are they actually using the meters to control electricity in those homes or businesses?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, you're asking how many AMI capable meters are in place today and have service switch capability. How broad is today's exposure?
Yes.
Does that paraphrase your question? I cannot answer accurately because I do not have the information from my competitors. But I do know that Itron has on the order of millions of meters that are in place and disconnect switch capable now. And that's primarily residential, but there is some commercial and industrial.
But, I mean, disconnect, that's a pretty gross measure. I mean, I was thinking more about controlling appliances within the house, which is the advertised benefit of load control.
Hand control. All I have seen is experimental systems, pilot systems. I haven't seen any fully rolled out commercial systems with appliance level control. I believe that a majority of the utilities and manufacturers are waiting for the finalization of Smart Energy Profile 2. There is some stuff that's being experimented with SE Profile 1.0 and 1X. But as far as a commercial rollout, again, this is my personal statement, I'm not aware of any at this time.
Okay, we have a question from WebEx here. To what extent does OpenWay comply with C12.22?
Okay, I'm going to do something really kind of naughty here. I am not necessarily here to discuss Itron's compliance with different security standards. Because this is an industry conference, I'm trying very hard to stay away from being product specific about things, except in the sense where I don't know things because I don't work for another manufacturer. A good answer to that question can probably be found on the itron.com website, or you can send me an email, robert.former@itron.com, and I will be happy to answer that question on a one-to-one basis.
Okay. Let me ask another here. How likely is it that distribution operations would fall under NERC, FERC, SIP, or another regulatory oversight, since distribution operation would also have effect on grid stability? If not, how would that be addressed?
This is a question that is burning throughout the industry today because there is a theoretical capability of meeting the requirement of FERC, NERC, and SIP to shed 300 megawatts of load. It hasn't been demonstrated yet, but the regulatory bodies are beginning to pay attention to it. I'm not really certain where they're going to go with it. Everybody has their own opinions. Some people think that distribution is going to come under the control of federal regulations, but then that's countered by people who say, but this is state regulation territory and the federal government has no business saying things in here. So it's a very wide question, which unfortunately I don't have much of an answer to. Well, I'm really batting 100 up here, aren't I?
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
So I'll ask one, Tim. Robert, I'll ask this very generically, so it's not specific to Itron.
Okay.
But what do you think are the major technical challenges? So you talked very much about the threats, and that was really useful to us. But now if we talk about the solutions, and you did say that there were a lot of solutions, but to get a little more technical, what do you think are the major technical challenges left, if any, on large-scale deployment? So as we move much beyond the scale we see today, I mean, is it key management? Is it encryption? Is it software upgrade? There are many it could be. Which ones of those are more or less solved and just need to be deployed in a large-scale way, and which ones remain the major challenges?
Fortunately, through the pilot programs that a number of utilities have put in place, and the research that a number of utilities have commissioned through third parties, which means that the results are a little more valid in the eye of the public because these third-party companies don't have much to gain from the results one way or the other. The primary problems were originally around the ability to control the service switch and the ability to manage that control. And the approach that has been pretty universally taken is command encryption, command signing. Validating, the meter has to validate that a command is actually supposed to be able to operate the disconnect switch, that it's supposed to be able to download new firmware into it. So the primary challenge from a security standpoint, okay, I can't really speak to the operational stuff, but from a security standpoint, the ability to assure that unauthenticated commands cannot be executed, that the meter cannot be compromised by firmware, and that the results coming back from the meter are valid and accurate. And those have primarily been addressed through encryption and key management. And those problems, as far as I'm concerned, are solved. I believe a majority of the vendors have some form of encryption in place and operational, commercialized and good to go. And if you have encryption, you have key management. Key management and encryption evolve all the time. There are improvements all the time. But it's in the field, it's in production, it's commercial.
How much do you think the benefits of AMI would be directly related to the regulation that you have in place in terms of, I mean, this is slightly different from the threats from AMI, but also related in some way because a lot of states are afraid of passing regulation which exposes consumers to, say, real-time pricing or allows utilities to charge dynamic prices. But it's also one of the things that people say that AMI, if you couple AMI with a dynamic pricing scheme, then there's a lot of benefit in terms of electricity payments which could be reduced. So is there how much benefit of AMI would actually depend on having the right kind of regulation?
The thing is, the benefit of AMI is not solely tied to time of use billing. Time of use billing is really, it has a great deal to do with how a utility's business model works as to whether or not it's actually going to bring benefit. It is one of the great advertised benefits, the ability to shape how consumers use power by making it more expensive to use it at high utilization times. But there are also benefits in the service switch. My understanding is that it costs roughly $100 to roll a truck out and disconnect a meter. Now, if you have a high turnover town like Champaign-Urbana area with a lot of university students who leave at the end of the semester, Lansing, Michigan is another good example, high turnover area. You can operate those disconnect switches when people move in and out of apartments much more readily, and there's huge cost savings in doing that. That alone has justified the cost of some AMI deployments.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I just wanted to know if the other benefits of AMI are cost effective, because there's a cost involved in installing that meter out there and then having the right sort of telemetry to go with the meter. So I just wanted to know if the other benefits of AMI sort of make it, does it make it a good investment to have that AMI out there?
Okay, so if I understand your clarification, and I do apologize, I have very poor hearing and the sound is only coming out of speakers in the back. You're asking, does time of use actually have a cost benefit in the installation of AMI?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I think you pretty much answered my question. I'm pretty sure you answered.
Yes, time of use does have a cost benefit. It's based on the business model of the utility. It is not the sole cost benefit of AMI. Business intelligence is also a good benefit. It's harder to quantify in dollars and cents, but it does improve the operations of the utility and their ability to react to small area outages much more quickly.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So we just talked about the security challenges that remain for AMI, and you have the opinion that authentication, access control basically provides a solution for meter security at this point. Now I would liken that to having a firewall to protect a network. So we have firewalls up in place, they provide access control, but then we also have network intrusion detection systems to detect when those defenses have failed, because attackers are constantly devising new attacks that may be effective against the defenses that are currently in place. And I mean, I hate to go back to Stuxnet, but there were compromised certificates in use in that situation, and that would have compromised the authentication type of mechanisms. So do you see a role for intrusion detection systems in advanced metering systems, and then what challenges do you see in developing those?
I do see a role for IDS-IPS in advanced metering systems. However, the traditional approach for IDS-IPS is very processing heavy. And it's one thing to consider putting an IDS-IPS system in a rack in a data center where it's protected, you don't have to have it weather hardened, and you don't need 20,000 of them. We move to a different order of magnitude altogether when you talk about putting IDS-IPS systems as they exist today into the field. Because there's the concern that how far into the field do I have to push it? Okay, if I have a meter compromise on a neighborhood level that doesn't hit the neighborhood aggregation point, well, can that compromise run rampant through that neighborhood and we'll never know about it? Is it a firmware replacement? So do we need to have IDS-IPS? Do we need to treat it as HIPS, host-based IPS on the meter? Okay, there's an idea. Problem is, the microcontrollers in these meters are not the world's most powerful. We're dealing with ARM7s, for example, is one. Renesas M16Cs. These are microcontrollers. These are embedded systems. These are not designed to do heavy lifting math or rapid data access that's required to do signature-based detection. Okay, so let's add a processor that will do that, or let's add a subprocessor that will do that. Okay, that's a great idea. That's a good technical solution. But now we run into the difference between a good technical solution and a good business solution. What happens when you add 50 cents in cost to a meter? 50 cents, I mean, come on. I throw that away when I clean out my couch, right? Multiply that by 5.5 million. Now you're starting to talk about real money again. 50 cents is a lot of money on a per unit basis. And I'm here to tell you that 50 cents doesn't get paid by the utility. It comes off the profit margin of the company that makes the meter. So I am not saying that we shouldn't be doing IDS-IPS. I am saying we should be doing IDS-IPS. But I believe that we need to craft a new approach to doing it. There need to be new models. And some of the work that's being done here at UIUC, based on the demonstrations that I saw today, is really leading the way in what can happen with that. Some of the behavioral modeling and the communications modeling and the system state modeling. This is the direction I believe that IDS-IPS is going to have to go to be effective in an AMI system, because traditional IDS-IPS, it can sit at the head end and it can be very effective at the head end. But once you move out into the field, I will say, there are some things that will serve as very, very rudimentary IDS-IPS. Most of the AMI systems out there have some IP component to it. And having an IP component to it means that enterprise people have a much better grasp of how to work with these things. That means that access control lists have been built into these things. And when the access control lists are violated, they have a tendency to write events upline to the system. So you can see in a rudimentary fashion when somebody is doing a port sweep, for example. Well, there is no valid reason for a port sweep to occur in the wide area network of an AMI system, so obviously there's something wrong. To get down to the subtleties of a low and slow worm crawling between meters, that's going to require a great deal more work. I believe it can be done. I believe it will happen. How long it will take to do it, I don't know.
Thank you.
Not to put you on the spot, but what is your vision for AMI or for smart metering in the next 2 to 5 years?
To make me a lot of money.
Where do you see it? Where do you see it going? What do you see evolving?
What I have seen in AMI, I've seen some very exciting systems that have been installed in the last couple of years, and I have seen monumental improvements in the systems that are being installed and upgrades in the systems that have been installed. We're working the kinks out. Technologically speaking, AMI is moving forward at a great, I'm not going to say breakneck pace, because the power industry is pretty conservative to begin with. I mean, you're building a piece of equipment that has to live for 20 years on the side of a house in a New England winter, for example. You're really conservative on your build when you do that. When you put something in the field, you don't want to have to go out there in 5 years and pull it back out. So as the current AMI systems prove themselves in this environment, I believe you're going to see greater acceptance by the public and by the utilities and by the public utility commissions of AMI systems. And this will lead to a growth, and I believe it's inevitable that AMI is going to happen because the business case for it is simply too strong not to do it. We just need to address the operational concerns, the security concerns, and a threat I forgot to mention. And I brought this up at lunch. Utilities and meter companies for decades have built meters where the security perimeter is the glass. The concern is inside the meter. There's no way to get inside it without violating the glass. Now, it's a whole different universe. The entire industry is having to deal with the concept of remote attacks, of denial of service, of disconnect switches, and now this has become understood much, much better in the years since AMI has started. There's a line, I believe, from the musical Oklahoma, something about the farmer and the cowboy should be friends. The meter shop and the IT people need to be friends. The meter shop and the IT people need to understand that they each have operational concerns that need to be addressed. And sometimes they're at loggerheads as to how to go about it. Whose concern is greater? Is it security? Is it the ability to move the data? Or is it the ability to keep the electricity flowing into that house when it's supposed to be? These questions are being answered by the companies that have been pioneers and put these systems in place. But one of the threats is in organizations that do not learn how to bridge that gap, that leaves an opening. In and of itself, it's an operational threat. If you don't fix that disconnect between departments and between universes, if you will, the threat is that the system will fail simply because you can't agree on how to operate it. Now, once again, every utility that I have worked with to date as a consultant and as an employee of Itron has figured this out. It can be done. You just need to be aware that it needs to be done. There have been some missteps and some hurt feelings over the years on this one, but I think that the lessons learned from the pioneers can be applied going forward, and we can avoid opening that threat up.
Well,
I
thanks,
think we're out
Robert,
of time.
for a very stimulating talk. I especially like the discussion that happened. There are some questions that have queued up on the WebEx, but we don't have time for that. But I'm sure that Robert would be happy to answer them if you send them to him by email. It's
robert.former@itron.com.
Itron.com. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much for having me today.